Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to wait just a couple more minutes to make sure everyone gets in.
Natural gas was imported from Russia. Warsaw and other countries nearest Russia have been.
Hi guys, as we begin the program, we're going to ask everyone to mute your computers so that we can hear our presenters. And there will be a time where we will invite you to come off of mute and to engage in the program. But so that we don't have background noise drowning out people, we're going to ask that people mute their programs, their computers. Also, please know that this session is being recorded. And so if you don't want your face shown, you can turn your cameras off. And that way we can still hear you and you can engage, but you won't be seen if that's your choice.
Thanks, Kerwin.
You're welcome.
We'll begin in just a couple minutes. Okay, we're at 7:05, so we're going to start because as always with Let's Talk About Race, we think we have a great program for everyone tonight. There are a couple announcements I want to make about the library. The first of which is there is a fundraiser being done by the foundation of the library called Books, Brews, and Library News. And it's going to be a casual backyard get-together to benefit the Red Bank Public Library Foundation. The cost of the event is $25 and will be featuring beer and food from Red Tank, and Red Rock. And there'll also be acoustic stylings from Chuck Lambert. If you need any information about this, you can always go on our website or call the library. And I also want to encourage everyone to sign up for the Red Bank Public Library newsletter, because although you get a lot of news on our website, it's a weekly newsletter that lets you know all the events that are happening that week, and you actually will get more information than you would on the website. We have a lot of programs that are now opening up that aren't virtual. We're back to in-person story time. We're back to a lot of programming that you can come into the library. We're really hoping that, I have a question. The date of the fundraiser is May the 13th, and it's from 7 to 9 p.m. Thanks for asking that. Anyway, Let's Talk About Race is going into its 7th year this August, and certainly at that point in time, we hope to be able to be back at the library so that if you want to be with us in person, you can, and also be able to offer virtual programming for people that aren't in proximity of the library. There are so many things happening at the library. I simply can't take the time right now to tell you about all of them. So I ask that you look on the website, but I do want to mention a couple things that are especially exciting. One is we talk about a 24-hour library, and we are that with our virtual programming, with all the things that you can do online. But most exciting recently is that rather than rushing to the library before we close to get your materials, if you want books, DVDs, etc., we have a 24-hour locker system, and it's so simple. Again, you can get information about this online, but all you do is place a hold in the catalog and then select the Red Bank 24-hour locker as a way to pick up your items. You can do this when we're closed on Sunday or when we're closed late at night if you're coming home from work, whatever. You're still able to get materials by coming into the library, but the locker system is a way to use the library when we're not open. Also really exciting to the library is we now have a computer lab. We've always offered computers to the public, but now we have a special lab and we offer free computer training so you can gain skills. And also coming up in May is our internet and computer core certification. This begins May 23rd, will run to July 21st. And like every single thing else at the library, it is free. So we have great teachers for this computer lab. I really recommend that you come in and take advantage of this. You can also, we also offer individualized computer literacy program. So you're welcome to do that as well. But, you know, as always, the website gives information for this. You can register on the website, and you can call the library for more information. In addition, we have now a private, it's called Teletalk booth, where you can again register for this online. It's a semi-soundproof booth where you can have calls, private calls, perhaps talk to there's a lot of virtual medical appointments now. You can do that. You can also talk to the reference desk for more information about this. We have conversational Spanish that happens virtually. The children's story time is once again taking place at the library. And luckily now, masks are not something required, but if you feel more comfortable wearing a mask, we encourage you to do so. I think that's about it. I'm going to turn the program over to Kerwin Webb, who is a man who wears many hats. And one other thing before I turn it over to Kerwin, I want to make an announcement for those of you who might know him. Sid Bernstein is instrumental in our conversation about race. He has been with our program, but Gilda Rogers and Sid started Citizens for a Diverse Society, which actually began before our Let's Talk About Race program. And Sid is turning 91 years old on Friday. So for those of you that know him, if you can send him an email, or, you know, if you have his phone number, a text or a card or whatever, I'm sure he'd love to hear from you. So he tells me that he's 91 years old, young, not old. But, anyway, now we go to Kerwin, who is a member of our Let's Talk About Race committee. He's a development consultant. He's a learning facilitator, and he's about to be ordained minister. Kerwin wears many, many hats and is known not just in Red Bank, but throughout Monmouth County. So Kerwin, I turn it over to you. You're muted.
Somebody always has to do that, right? Thank you, Linda, for that.
You're welcome.
And thank you all for joining us for this program tonight. This program is one that is near and dear to me because of the topic, and also because of who is presenting. So tonight's presenter or leader of this is author, historian, Rick Geffken. He's a Monmouth County resident who has done tremendous research and work on issues around the dark underbelly of New Jersey and the stories of slavery and racism. And so his program tonight, Reparations and Reconciliation, is really intersectional in some of the work that I do. Rick and I are both a part of the New Jersey Social Justice Remembrance Coalition that is working to have a monument installed, a marker installed in Eatontown, memorializing and bringing remembrance to New Jersey's only documented lynching. And so you'll hear more about some of the work of that coalition probably later on in this talk. But I'm just really excited to bring and present to you Rick Geffken, the author of Stories of Slavery in New Jersey. And Rick is going to lead us for the first part. And then, as always, there will be a Q&A session to follow if need be. So Rick, take it away.
Thank you very much, Kerwin, for that very generous introduction. But before I get started, I'm going to walk out of your view here to close the blinds on this late afternoon sunset. Hang on.
All right.
Kerwin, do you want to take this time to just mention what's happening at the end of May in Eatontown?
Yeah, so it's actually June 18th.
Oh.
The historical marker. So the project that Rick and I, the coalition, New Jersey Social Justice Remembrance Coalition, we are working in partnership with the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery. And the final component, one of the final components of that work is to have a historical marker installed in Eatontown. So June 18th, 12 noon at Wampum Park in Eatontown, that will be the marker unveiling ceremony. And Rick is a part of the committee that is working on that. And so he can give us more details or more info about that, and then he can go into his presentation.
Perfect.
Okay, great. I'm back. And although I didn't expect this kind of spring any more than I imagine any of you did, at the same time, I want to make sure we can all see. Okay, is my
Yes.
first slide up there?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. So thanks everyone for coming tonight to our what I hope is going to be a very interactive conversation. I'm going to suggest two things, if you'd help me out here. First, I've got only a very few slides to keep the discussion going, so I won't bore you with a lecture. And secondly, very importantly, if you could, and if you're not too shy, if you could put yourself on video so we can see your faces live and engage with you, I think that would be terrific. Because what I'm going to try to do as I facilitate this tonight is to ask some questions and invite your opinions, which are very important, and I'll tell you why. I am no expert on reparations and reconciliation. I've been reading about it for the last several months, and I've found an awful lot of information that we'll review just the highlights of tonight. And the reason I mention that is everyone here tonight is as equally expert as I am. You're all going to have your opinions about this, and I value them because this is a topic that I strongly believe is going to be, certainly through the end of my life, one of importance that will engage the American public for a very long time, probably longer than we all want, but I'm sure it's going to do that. So I will tell you my personal opinion. My personal opinion, and it's only that, is that reparations are due to the descendants of enslaved people. And I've got some ideas about that personally and from experts that I'll talk to you about tonight. But that's just my opinion. That doesn't mean I'm right. And your ideas and thoughts will enliven this presentation. So with that in mind, who else can we start with better than this man? Okay, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm sure at one point or another you've come across this wonderful quote from him way back in 1963. And the part that I highlighted here is part of what we're going to talk about tonight, because as he always did with his analogies and wonderful references, he comes up with just this perfect phrase. And in this case, having talked about the national debt, he says, it's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as our citizens of color are concerned. Now that was 1963. And I'm going to posit that not a whole lot has changed regarding this. So the subject tonight will be about your ideas and some experts that I'll reference about how to redress this for the most obvious of reasons. But maybe they're not obvious, okay? Not too long ago, they weren't obvious to me. So I want to frame this right now this way, and I'm going to begin by asking all of you, when you feel comfortable, to unmute yourself and to help me and everyone else understand, whoops, I'm going to go back up, this very basic thought. Why are reparations and reconciliation necessary in the United States? So open mics, folks, whatever you want. And if you get shy, I'll revert to my teacher training and I'll start calling names. But let's see, who'd like to comment on this to start us off? See how shy and polite they all are?
Yeah.
So
I don't know if you can see, I can't see the faces. I don't know why, when the screen share is on. This is
Yeah,
Christine speaking.
Hi, Christine.
Hi. So because so much of our infrastructure, our economy from colonial times was all built with slave labor, that's why reparations are necessary. And I think that needs to happen in order for reconciliation to proceed. The mechanics of it and the working parts of it are what is confusing to me. What would it look like? And I'll stop there because that's probably a question coming up.
And that's what I love. She gives a summary of her belief, and then she said, but I don't know, basically.
Right.
How do we do this? So who else would like to comment on this?
Rick, if
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to interject that we're also talking about indigenous people as well. So,
There's a person with us tonight who will no doubt love to talk about that.
hopefully.
I was just going to say that I think everything that has led up to the enormous institutionalized Black and brown racism in this country has been made by a conscious choice. It was a conscious choice to engage in slavery. It was a conscious choice more recently to engage in redlining. It's been a conscious choice to have segregated schools. It can be a conscious choice to have reparations and reconciliation. And I don't see how anything can, as fundamental as the institutionalization of racism, can be changed without those conscious choices.
Rick?
Excellent, excellent.
Linda Zuccaro?
Linda Zuccaro, go ahead.
Yeah, not that what I have to say is very much different from our last speaker, but we have created a systemic racist society, basically, and that has disadvantaged people, Black people, people of color, and others, indigenous peoples as well. And how else can you correct that or correct for it without a discussion about reconciliation and a plan for reparations in some form?
I definitely have thoughts, but I want to make sure that all of our participants, our guests, have opportunity before I say what I'm going to say.
One, two, three, four, 5 people who we can't, but Leo, go ahead.
Leo,
I was thinking of the truth and reconciliation processes in South Africa and Canada. And so rather than just simply thinking in financial terms of reparation, I think the truth and reconciliation, I think, provides a model of owning up to our history. And there are forces that want to whitewash the history and not, not address what our history is. So I think that's a starting point of reparation and reconciliation, is to be honest about our history and to combat forces that want to suppress an unpleasant truth.
we are hearing a television in the background.
That was Leo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody
So-
else? Go ahead, Carolina, if you have something else.
Yeah, and it sort of touches on a little bit of what Leo said. Reparations and reconciliation are necessary if people believe there is a problem. And like Leo said, there are people who would like to whitewash. There are certain people who don't see it as necessary because they don't see anything wrong with the way that things are. So I will just problematize your question by saying that we have to clarify who we're talking about, because for some they'll say it's not.
I also have a thought. It occurs to me, with some of the way these conversations go, there are certain people who just have this built-in resistance, such as, that was then, this is now. And I think in having this conversation, ask someone, well, what would you think is justice if your grandfather was robbed basically of his livelihood, his home, his education, such that it even his own children were then handicapped because of insufficient resources, etc., and that it still now has filtered down to you personally. So this is something that is not, it's not all in the distant history as in hundreds of years ago, but in living memory for, let's say, people my age. So I think thinking of some of the laws and policies and practices that have been in place in my very own lifetime up until today, and how can we have a civilized conversation about that, about justice?
Anyone else want to pitch in? Okay, and everybody said wonderful things. And of course, we're on this call tonight because we're believers. But I think Kerwin brings up the excellent point that we're all aware of, and Leo alluded to it too, that there are many, many, many people who do not think that these reparations or reconciliations are necessary. And it's denial for any number of reasons. And that's going to be the challenge. Okay, but let me just review that a couple of reasons why I believe personally, and a lot of other people believe that these are necessary. And these came out of my researches into enslavement in New Jersey, which I knew nothing about growing up. And when I discovered the horrors that was slavery, I felt compelled that I had to do more. Okay. So as Kerwin mentioned, I'm on several committees with him and other folks to do something more than just, recapitulate the past. So just a couple of bullet points here that I've learned, and I'm sure a lot of people here know this. For instance, there were approximately, and nobody has the real number, 500,000 enslaved, mostly Africans, who were brought to the original 13 colonies, including New Jersey. Okay, New Jersey in particular, the enslavement movement, if you will, started here in the early 1620s with the Dutch in Bergen County. And also not too far from us, as I know a lot of you know, here in Tinton Falls in the 1670s, when an Englishman named Lewis Morris brought enslaved people from Barbados. I think it's worth mentioning, as everybody knows, that this country was built with the help of a lot of people, and the most overlooked and overworked people in that group in the early provincial and then colonial days were African Americans, enslaved people, Native Americans who were also enslaved or denied their rights and whose land was stolen. Okay. It's also worth talking to the point that in 1804, New Jersey attempted something called the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, but it took until 1865 and the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution for slavery to be outlawed once and for all. And then, as you know, and again, we won't get into this tonight, but it's very, very important that we understand that even though there was this almost momentary feeling of guilt and liberation in the wake of the Civil War, when Black people, former slaves, were promised a lot, within a very few years, all of that went away. And thus began the Jim Crow period, which lasted certainly into the mid 20th century in a lot of places. And we've already mentioned, I think it was Judy, redlining and some other things that continue to this day. So clearly the society has got problems. You know, if you watch the news any night, read the paper any day, you will, you can't help but see what I believe is the results of this unaddressed situation that we had at the earliest possible times in our country's history of enslavement. Okay, so that's kind of the background. Now, my next question to everybody, are these the same concepts? Open mic.
No.
And why not?
One has to do with repairing the damage and the harm that was done. And then the second, the reconciliation, is bringing back together those, in this case, the people who were torn apart because of the harm that was done. So one is repair and one is bringing back together.
I think it's fair to say, though, that I don't think you could have either without the other. I agree with Kerwin that they're not identical, but both require the other to be completed.
I would suggest that reparations, broadly defined, has to come first.
Yeah.
And that would lead to reconciliation. And what groups are we talking about here, folks? Who needs to be reconciled?
Well, as was mentioned, the indigenous Americans and the other people of color that were enslaved, the African American descendants.
And they need Christine to
But
be
reconciled, I guess reconciled with the majority. I mean, I don't know if we were ever conciled. That's not a word, but how do you reconcile if we were never actually, if most of the people didn't think of us as one in the first place, if we didn't have a concept of human unity? So reconciliation, there is probably another word for bringing together people to recognize their oneness.
Can
I would
I
think
jump?
for historically too, for reconciliation to even be a possibility, there has to be reconciliation of white folk in this country reconciling themselves to the historic past of this country, because without that, there's not going to be anything, or there's going to be this tokenism that's happened so frequently of reparation that is then, like, whether it's throwing money out or admitting guilt or complicity, whatever it is, whatever the form that takes, and then feeling like, okay, been there, done that, we're good now. Without the focus on complicity, engagement, I don't see how mutuality can occur. I think the basis of reconciliation has to be, I mean, it's like 95% of the onus is on people who identify as white to engage in a holistic society rather than focusing on reparations and saying, we are good now.
But just to get people to apologize for our past, as was mentioned, this is a really difficult thing. For people, white people, just to say we were wrong and to try to move forward and correct the way things were. I mean, just to apologize would be a major step.
And also just to admit that there was a problem in the first place and, you know, kind of change the heart, change the attitude. You know, how do you do that? You know, that to me is like reconciling the fact that yeah, this happened, this was an issue, rather than saying it happened long ago. You know, there are so many things that are reverberating now, you know, because of that. Like with the critical race theory and how so many people are in denial. There's so much pushback with that. And there's so much, you know, underneath that, there's fear and anger and just not wanting to admit that there was even a problem in the first place.
Right.
Before we go on, may I speak on something that Christine said about reconciled, like that there wasn't a point where we were reconciled. I want to say that honestly, there was. Early on, before chattel slavery, the type of slavery that becomes the way that we think of it, there were white and Black indentured servants that were laboring side by side. And one of the events that caused the distinction between the way that slavery was orchestrated was Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, where indentured servants, European indentured servants who were white and African indentured servants, they attempted to overthrow those who were enslaving them. And after that, what those who were in charge or in control found out was, we need to divide those groups, because it was the poor rising up against the rich. And so by dividing them based on race, that was the thing that made it easier for those who are in power to stay in control. So there was a point before where people saw themselves as just people. There was rich and poor, but the distinction between Black and white wasn't as big as it became.
Well, a follow-up to that is in West Virginia with the coal miners. I mean, it was a definite decision to divide Black and white coal miners. Also, we can't forget our Asian people who helped build the railroads out west, when, you know, that was also a type of slavery at that point in time. So pretty much across the board, people of color have been exploited.
So I think reconciling, and this sort of goes to what you all are saying, is people will have to reconcile their understanding with the true history of humanity of all people, and not just a created racial category that really doesn't exist. So reconciling ourselves to the humanness of others, I think.
So these are all insightful comments, and let me see if I can add to them. I love the fact that Christine brought up, was there even conciliation to begin with? And then, of course, the nuance that Kerwin brings up is there was. So on individual levels, seems to me, people do relate to one another as people sometimes. But on a societal level, in this country especially, and in a lot of societies across the world, that doesn't occur. As for instance, the last administration in this country, the president, okay, absolutely understood how to divide people by appealing to their fears and how people react to authority. And that was he made deliberate choices. And that's the history of the world, frankly. And certainly is the history of this country well in advance of that man. Okay, it was very early on, and Kerwin's exactly right, especially when the enslaved Black population began to grow and rebel in various and sundry ways, the white power structure got really nervous, really worried, and clamped down. And in New Jersey, there's a long history. There are dozens and dozens of legislative actions that were taken to so-called control the Black population, enslaved, and oh, by the way, post-slavery, which continues today. So these concepts are not anything from the distant past. They're present with us today. And everybody, just was spot on with the comments here. So let's go a little deeper if we can. And we've talked about these things, but let's see if we can look at them in a little bit more particularity. And then, of course, I want us all, as I do, to think, okay, what can I do? What can I do? I'm one person to affect change in these areas. So reparations. So, exactly right. Okay. It's rooted in the word repair. Okay. And, I did some quick searches, and, I can steal anything from the internet. And repair and reparations are about making amends for some wrong that's been done. And it doesn't just have to be money, of course, especially when we talk about this. And when you talk about money with people and reparations for the sins of enslavement, that gets real dicey real quickly. But otherwise helping those who have been wronged, and there are plenty of ways to do that as well. Okay, so that's a thought for us.
Rick,
Yes,
can I hopefully not derail the discussion, but throw something out that I found interesting?
absolutely. Go ahead.
I haven't read extensively, but I've read two authors who I think are valuable, and if people haven't read them, they might gain from them. Ta-Nehisi Coates has a long and excellent essay on the case for reparations. It was printed in the Atlantic. I think it's several years old, and it's accessible online. And the other is an economist at my alma mater, Duke University, Sandy Darity, who's written extensively from the economic point of view, particularly. And in both cases, I don't think I'm misquoting here. I'm misparaphrasing here. They've indicated the three main questions that have to be asked when you talk about reparations. And they're simple, but they're not so simple. Who gets, in what form, and who pays? And when you get down to those kinds of issues, which are pretty direct and base, you get a lot of pushback. I hope that didn't throw you off track.
That's the whole purpose of this discussion. That's absolutely perfect. Okay, exactly. As every comment that we've had so far and that we will continue to have is key to what we're talking about. What we're doing here tonight, folks, is very obviously in a small group, is we're coming together in a thought process that may or may not be reflected in the society in general, but that's what we all hope for. So we've already talked about some of these, but let me just give you some other food for thought. Okay, we have, and by no means do I put this little sentence up here to say that we did this continually and we did it successfully, but Native Americans have received land and money in various and sundry forms for the way their land was stolen and how they were moved, okay, by the United States government. That's an important point. Also, I hope you know, the United States government did reimburse Japanese Americans whose families had been interned during World War II in those obnoxious camps, most of them out west. Again, the US government did this. What we also did was, as part of the Marshall Plan after World War II, the United States government helped Jewish folks who had undergone the Holocaust and the descendants of those who were killed by making monetary reparations, and also making available to them investments. Again, the United States government did these things. Here's the question. And you know the answer. Doesn't exist. So we're beginning tonight in this group, and many groups across the country are talking about this, including some folks that have already been mentioned, to try to come to some agreement that will and hopefully can lead to reconciliation. Okay, now just recently, today, as a matter of fact, I don't want to say a breakthrough, but an encouraging start had begun. So you already know this. Several years ago, the Princeton Theological Seminary, which is not, by the way, connected with the university, decided, this is a New Jersey institution, decided to offer scholarships and help to the descendants of some of the enslaved people that they had in their origins. Jesuit, and I'm a Jesuit trained guy, Jesuits in Georgetown University several years ago did the same thing. Pretty successful program so far. Today's paper talked about Harvard University, which yesterday created a $100 billion so-called legacy of slavery fund for scholars and students of that university to start to think and investigate and record and document this. But the last word in that sentence is but. The report carefully avoided treading on the concept of direct financial reparations. Now that's a quote from the New York Times. That's not what Harvard said.
Right.
So you see the problem right encapsulated right here, right? Harvard University, following, I would suggest, what Princeton University has done for a while, which is to publicize their history of enslavement as a university, decides to fund, of course they've got the money, this huge study, but they avoid the discussion of payment to the descendants of enslaved. Now, God bless them, but that's a dodge. Okay? Now, having inflamed you with that, let me hear your reaction to my comment.
Well, I think perhaps their study has to precede any plan for direct financial reparations. But I hear you. It'll be another 100+ years before they get around to the essential point. However, I thought it was a good step in the right direction because I think I know it's a very prestigious university, and I think people will take note. And I think that is important. And I would throw out there, not directly on reparations, but to another one that I think is very interesting, and there are a lot of examples like this, is the Smithsonian Institution and the tremendous effort they are making to highlight in just about every area of their work, the contributions that have been made over the years. And I think that's all important and a part leading up to reconciliation.
No,
I just would like to throw out a few more points, even though they may be more digressions. Okay, we could throw up on the National Reparation Program, you can throw in there Evanston, Illinois, and their efforts to do this locally. And New Jersey's at this impasse about even able to get the study together to look at statewide reparations, and why this is held up in our state legislature is beyond me. Simply to have a task force appointed to initiate the work has not been, we haven't been able to do that. Our legislators don't seem to have the will. And also I'm not versed enough in any of the 3 points about what's happened with Native Americans. I know a little bit about Japanese Americans by having a best friend whose family was affected. And the same way that institutionalization of racist institutions and culture has created a trauma that's gone through generations. The same thing happened with Japanese Americans in that you got restitution for property that was taken from you. But for the people who were in internment camps, who rented a home, who did not have real property, they did not see any restitution for the 5 years of labor that they were robbed of and payment. And that reverberated through generations in the Japanese American community. The Marshall Plan did not help all Jews receive reparations. Again, only those who had some, my understanding anyway, is on the Marshall Plan, you had to document what was taken from you. Well, if you were in a shtetl, if you were in a ghetto, and you simply were removed and managed to survive the Holocaust, you don't have records to show what your family owned, if they ever owned anything. I mean, if you were not a landowner or a property owner, there's nothing to show. It was the same with the Japanese Americans. If we get caught up in these, in bureaucratizing everything with regards to reparations and reconciliations, I don't see how we can move forward if we get caught up in making this a bureaucratic problem.
Also, I just wanted to add that although we paid billions for various benefits and programs to Native Americans, unlike, Black Americans who were not able to buy land or decent land, we stole the land from the Native Americans. So I'm not even sure the billions of dollars really is enough for what was done. Also, we have a comment from Leo about the PBS NewsHour tonight. Leo, do you want to say that, or should I just read your chat? They interviewed Tamiko Brown Nagin about the Legacy of Slavery Fund.
Yeah, just a coincidence that she was interviewed tonight.
Mm-hmm.
So you might check out your PBS NewsHour.
Yeah, they've done a lot. They're doing a lot of work to provide information.
And by the way, to Linda's point, although this discussion sounds like we're talking about the descendants of African enslaved folks, clearly Native Americans were enslaved in some cases.
Right.
And just because they did receive land and other things doesn't mean that their reparations were complete, nor has reconciliation happened in all cases. So my point of those 3 bullets was just to say that there are government programs that have addressed reparations, except for the most egregious, lack of a program that we're talking about tonight. But
I want
to go ahead.
Yeah, so the first one under educational institutions efforts, Princeton Seminary, I was there as the seminary went through their process. I was the vice moderator of the Association of Black Seminarians that helped move them towards some of that. And one of our concerns, and they even had a conference on it, and representatives from Georgetown was there. And although these institutions are doing things, the devil's in the details. And so as you read through what they're doing, a lot of it is, I don't want to say more for show, but it's not what the students would say is enough. And the pushback that we got was that the endowment and the people who fund the school, they could only go so far. They would only be so far willing to go towards these things. And Rick, I think you're going to get to it with William Darity's book, but he would say that these efforts shouldn't be considered reparations. And I don't want to step on what you're doing, but although it's a good gesture, they're great things, he wants to draw a distinct line between what is considered reparations and what's not. And I'll wait till you get there to say more about this.
Yeah, excellent point. And by the way, it seems to me, and I think we all agree, we live in a capitalist society, okay? Yeah. And we either benefit from it or sometimes we don't. And so when we get into discussions of monetary reparations, everybody gets antsy, secondly, it seems to me that bureaucracies, government or corporate or any other kind of bureaucracies, move agonizingly slowly. And what we can do as individual citizens, as we're doing tonight, quite frankly, is to help these things along. Okay, because if we wait for bureaucratic relief in anything, you'll wait forever, seems to me.
Well, that's a good segue into my question, Rich. Was Jim White?
Go ahead.
These three programs you mentioned, I know virtually nothing about them, but you know, there had to be some sort of impetus, some sort of political impetus for these things to happen. I mean, somebody must have, you know, some group or whatever had to make noise and do something in order to get something for Native Americans and Japanese Americans. The Marshall Plan thing, I think, was probably not necessarily, I don't know if that was voted on by Congress or not, but
Yeah.
which the other two had probably had to be, and there must have been some process by which that happened. And is there anything useful from knowing about that that could be applied to reparations in this country for slavery?
So let's go back to Kerwin. I had no idea, and I'm delighted to find out about the Princeton Theological Seminary connection, Kerwin. How did that begin?
So I think that started because Princeton University did a study, I think might have been months or a year or so before the seminary did. And there were students on campus that were saying, hey, Princeton University is doing this. You should do this as well. And so President Barnes, Craig Barnes, commissioned a 2-year study. I think it was in 2015 or so is when it started. And they published the results of that study, Princeton Seminary and Slavery, in 2018. And it's still online. If you would like, I'll put the link in there. And so it goes through some of the founders, some of the first seminary professors, and what that report was careful to do was to say that the seminary did not own any slaves. That the seminary didn't directly benefit from it, but the authors of the report drew the line to, okay, you might not have directly owned slaves, but the people who were financing you, they made their money from the slave trade, right? And so after that process, the report came out, and then they had a listening session for the students to weigh in about what do we do about this? Because their thing is reconciliation, repentance and repair, I think is what they were titling it. And that's how we got involved. And it was interesting because the Board of Trustees tasked administrators, they hand selected a committee of administrators and a couple of students. And that task force was sort of going to be the buffer between the students and the Board of Trustees. But in the end, we got it to where we could actually have students address the Board of Trustees instead of having that task force be the middleman. And that was an interesting challenge because that was meetings with the president and the dean of student life. It was, we felt accomplished with what we got. We wanted to do more, but we had to realize if you ask for too much, if you try to go too far out there, then they would be able to dismiss everything that you're trying to do. And the thing that we were telling the next group that were coming behind us is institutions will try a politics of gradualism. We'll give you a little bit here, a little bit here, and then hopefully you'll go away. And so I think they did a 3 or 5 year plan. One of the things was naming the library after the first Black graduate, Theodore Sedgwick Wright. They're going to remove Samuel Miller's name from the chapel. He was a slave owner. Then the scholarships that you talked about. They also are funding the director of the Center for Black Church Studies, which they weren't doing. And so we had an interim director. We didn't have a full-time director. So those were some of the things. And the idea is that if we are able to get more Black students in and allow them the space to learn and grow, then that might help expand the impact and the knowledge of what was kept out.
So I think, Jim, that gives you one idea, but my personal opinion is that most politicians are reactionary. And back in the 60s, and I'm old enough to remember them, one of the phrases we used was power to the people. So I think this is a bottom-up movement, frankly, notwithstanding the good work that other people have done, including Harvard yesterday. Okay, I think it's us, the people who have to bring groups together, build a case, and make bureaucracies move in the direction we want them to, no matter how slowly. Now, that's my personal opinion, but I think it happens in a lot of ways. That's not to say there aren't enlightened corporate heads or enlightened politicians every once in a while who might, on their own, come to some wonderful ideas. But I think unless they have, especially politicians, unless they have the support and backing of the people who are putting them there, they won't do it.
Right.
They got plenty to do. So,
Rick, could I just say we have quite a few things in the chat right now. Do you want to wait a little
yes, I do.
later
Go
for
ahead.
those?
Yeah, read a few and let's see what we got. Go
Okay,
ahead.
well, Claire Garland had written that 2/3 of college students are from Caribbean nations, not US students. And Kerwin did reply to that and said the questions about who would qualify was also a big sticking point in the discussions. Do you want to elaborate on that, Kerwin?
That's his next slide.
Yeah, we're going to get into that.
Okay.
But thank you, Claire. Claire has always got great ideas, and Kerwin too.
And Christine also asked if anybody could recommend a good book about the South African reparation process.
I'm gonna put a couple of them up in a second.
Okay. And Leo asked what percentage of US college students are foreign? He said 4.6%. International students make up 4.6% of the total US student population, down from 5.5% in 2019. And he's also given us a link. Kerwin's given us a link. So everybody just take a look at the chat because it's been fairly active tonight. And also any thoughts about affirmative action. So there are a lot of questions, Rick.
Yeah, well, many of which I have no answer for, but this group will come up with answers, I'm sure. Okay, let's move to this.
The third, Kathy Chow and Ken Howe, Charles Rosenblum, the Philadelphia.
Okay, so now these are suggestions that I read from other folks who will become obvious in a couple seconds. Among the sort of prerequisites that we can consider is that a person eligible for slavery reparations could be a Black person who can trace their heritage to people enslaved in the United States territory or the territories. These folks might be eligible, probably should be eligible, in my opinion, for financial compensation. Financial compensation being a very, very touchy topic. For instance, aren't we proud that our own New Jersey Senator Cory Booker would be an obvious public figure who's descended from enslaved folks? So he would be eligible. Now, he's just a prominent person, but there are people on this call tonight, and we all have friends who would be equally eligible. And this includes, by the way, the descendants of Native Americans who were enslaved. Okay, so I probably should have said that there too. So that seems to me basic, but I think the discussion might veer a little bit when people get worried that, oh my God, all Black people in the United States are going to want money now. I know that's a topic that scares the bejesus, literally, out of a lot of people. And I think it's a false issue, but that doesn't mean it's not real to the people who advocate it. So comments on this?
Rick, it's Claire.
Yes, hi.
I had a woman call me the other day. She saw my name in the paper and got my number and called me. and started up on Black folks have more than she has. And of course, I've never met her. She didn't know me. I didn't know her. So she obviously didn't know to whom she was speaking. And I asked her, what did Black folks have that she didn't have? Of course, that led into no comments, but then she got on the statues. They shouldn't be taking all the statues down. And we're going to take this country back. And as I tried to talk to her about it, she just slammed the phone down. So that's a lot of the sentiment out there that
And
Black
Claire,
folks
by
have
the
more
way,
than she has.
Claire, by the way, for folks that don't know you, can you reveal a little bit about your heritage so people understand?
My family was here in Monmouth County for many years, a couple hundred years, mainly in Eatontown and Tinton Falls, and later in Asbury Park and Neptune. And our family had a Cherokee and Delaware heritage, which we have tried to remember through the years. Lots of land, and Reedy Town, some of you might have heard of. Sand Hill, you might have heard of.
Thank you, thank you. And you know, you're a much more gracious person than me to even listen to a stranger on the phone. But that person's emblematic, it seems to me, of misunderstanding, to be the kindest thing I can think, and adamant, almost hatred of the whole idea that people deserve compensation. There's a lot of those folks, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Okay, let's again move on just to some talking points. Reconciliation, okay, and this is a couple of things I found in the last few days, and I don't, again, profess to be an expert. But clearly reconciliation, as we've already talked about, is very closely aligned with amnesty and forgiveness. And it's under, you'll find references to, under different names, of course, reconciliation in many, many religious traditions. So I was raised Catholic and educated by the Jesuits, and I might suggest that those are not necessarily synonymous. But in the Christian tradition, and anyone here can jump in, this is just me copying something I read, redemption is forgiveness or deliverance from sin. Okay, the result of atonement, and it's the end of an estrangement between God and humanity. So some religious traditions focus on the person who has sinned, focused on it, not to exclude the person who has been sinned against. That's just one example. And again, I'm out of my depth here, but what I could find was that within Buddhism, reconciliation means a return to amicability, and it requires more than just forgiveness. It's a reestablishment of trust. I love that concept right there. I mean, how can you separate reconciliation from lack of trust, from, I should say, trust? Again, I'm out of my depth, but for the within Judaism, redemption is primarily concerned about God redeeming people. The original tradition started with the exile and enslavement back in Egyptian times. Redemption is salvation from the states or circumstances and for the desire of human existence or human existence itself. Again, these are encapsulations, they're not deep dives into it. In Islam, which I know very, very little about, reconciliation apparently refers to making peace when there's a dispute. Okay, it's got to do with forgiveness, personal forgiveness, which leads to divine forgiveness. So you can see the through lines between all of these, right? Now, different focuses and different emphases, but at the same time, the desire in the religious community is always to reconcile with God and with the person who has been wronged. Now, Patty, you're gonna have to help me on this one, okay? Because I do not know about this, except what I read, that the Baha'i community believes that all human beings are equally God's creations, and therefore have to be treated without prejudice. The same, we are all human beings. That goes obviously beyond this one community. Unfortunately, in the history of enslavement, and today even, there are people who never believed that the enslaved were full human beings.
Hmm.
And that is a fundamental problem that dates back to the beginnings of this country. So
Thank you.
comments on those ideas.
Yeah, Rick, that is exactly the way to phrase the Baha'i belief. And like you said, one of the core origins of where we are now is when groups of people fully believed that other groups were not exactly human, that they were either subhuman or just an inferior form. So recognizing that each human being is equal in the eyes of the one creator, however you view the creator or the creative force. But what I was thinking of as you were going through this also is something I've read a little bit about. I don't know much about. I don't know if anyone here does. The concept of or practice of restorative justice in certain societies of the world, when a person commits a wrong or even a crime. And I know this has some history in places like Hawaii and I think the South Pacific and perhaps some other indigenous societies, that the person who commits the wrong has to be in communication with the person that they wronged. The chief or whoever is the leader can help with the process. Amends have to be made, atonement. All of these things that you've mentioned come to play, forgiveness, reestablishing trust. These are profound human virtues that have to be included in this conversation. I'm really so glad you brought it up. In fact, these are principles that the Equal Justice Initiative focuses on when they're working on behalf of, for example, the monuments to the lynchings that occurred in this country, and asking communities to, quote, take ownership of their own history, etc. It seems to me that there's a tremendous resistance in the conversation about even reconciliation, let alone reparations, is because it's so embedded in, well, the world and certainly in our country, that you're talking almost about, dismantling things, to get to the heart of it. And yet it's not really. It's just acknowledging that we all deserve justice.
Thank you. And by the way, this is not an exclusive list of the world's religions. Of course, there are many, many more. But I'd like to think that we're going to find similar themes throughout the different traditions. Let's see where I'm going here. Okay. We mentioned some of this, and we certainly wouldn't have time to get into these in any kind of depth, but the South African commissions that addressed the centuries of apartheid, okay, their Commission on Truth and Reconciliation, did historic work, which included, by the way, financial, symbolic, and community reparations. So it's not just money in all cases. We talked about this a little, but the German government paid a tremendous amount of money, as well as what the United States did, to reimburse, if you will, the Holocaust victims. Canada, I think Leo mentioned the First Peoples up in Canada, their Truth and Reconciliation Committee Commission talked about the injustice that had been done to Indian children, so-called, who were sent to schools and discouraged from learning about their own culture, even speaking their own languages. So that's an ongoing process to try to reconcile those disparities. People ask for books. There are lots and lots of books. Okay, so you can see on the left one that talks about South Africa. Patty White actually brought up the middle book to me that I had not been familiar with, nor have I read yet. And then the commission up in Canada did issue a report. So, quick online search, you'll come up with dozens and dozens of books about this topic. Now, and we're getting toward the end, but we'll stay on as long as we have to. Okay. Here's a terrific quote, right? And it echoes what Martin Luther King had said purposely, I'm sure. That the federal government's own policies help to create this racial wealth divide.
Rick, your
Rick, it's
sound
hard
isn't
to hear
coming
you.
through.
Yeah. You're much lower your voice than you were.
Yeah,
Okay,
just check. There you go.
Better,
okay.
much better.
So where did I steal that from? Okay, as already been mentioned, these wonderful people. I just finished this book, and it does a wonderful job of building the case by going into some very ugly facts in our country's history. And in some cases, they're repetitions of the 1619 Project revelations, but they're worth reading. And I believe that Linda mentioned, of course, and she should be proud of the Duke heritage here as well. This is a book that was recommended to me by Walter Grayson. Who else would I believe that would lead me to something this good? So things to consider. And this is from their book, okay, and their ideas, and it's the last chapter of summation, but I want to introduce this to us. As we already have discussed, their belief and mine, of course, is that the US government bears responsibility for those things. And therefore, our Congress should decide, underline the word decide, reparations and how they're going to be made. But we can't rely on our government in addressing this the way we want. We, as the people, have to contribute to our own local and state and then eventually national politicians to make sure they understand the urgency that we believe this needs to be addressed with. Again, the criteria that they suggest in the book is that you should have, in order to be eligible for reparations to be defined later, at least one enslaved ancestor and some kind of proof. And this is going to be very, very difficult for some people to come up with. Okay, not that they don't identify as Black, but also the proof that they have an ancestor who was once enslaved. That's a topic, might be another good topic for us to talk about one day. Now, again, let's get to money for one. The way that is suggested in their book that we calculate the amount of money is based on what's called present value for, among other things, the wages that were not paid to the enslaved for what they did, including maybe their purchase price when they were sold, or maybe land that was promised to the formerly enslaved, the 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War kind of thing that never happened, or most likely a combination. This is a very, very tricky thing because it's going to get into millions and billions and maybe trillions of dollars. And so you can expect that there's going to be a lot of pushback from that. And so maybe there should be a portfolio of reparations, payments aimed at eliminating the racial wealth gap, etc. Scholarship funds. There's a lot of ways to do this. They also recommend the creation of Reparations Supervisory Board, elected by the folks that are eligible, once that's determined. So you have some kind of group that can oversee how reparations are effective. And they also recommend something called the National Reparations Bureau for management of the program and who can document the history of racial injustice. This is a huge plate of asks, okay? And they know, as well as you and I know, that they're not all gonna happen, nor even if they all do happen, they're not gonna happen in the sequence that would make sense, but they all are valuable. And if it's a stake in the ground to say these things have to be considered, so be it. Let's get going on this. So again, these are wonderful ideas. And oh, by the way, people like me, although I don't know that I have any slave-holding ancestors because my ancestors came in the mid-19th century from Ireland and Germany, but people who are white descendants of slaveholders, okay, should be encouraged to create their own organizations. Because there are many, and you've seen them in the news, white descendants of slaveholders who are very active and want to do the right thing, whatever that might be. So you see what's happening here. It's a blending of all levels of society. It's not Black people or Native American people advocating for give me my just desserts. It's everybody. And that's the concept of reparations, reconciliation, and forgiveness, isn't it? We all have a stake in this. And you could see where the tripwires are here. Okay, money, why them, why not me, et cetera, et cetera. I've got to believe, I think Linda said before 100 years, this is going to take a long time, but that doesn't mean we can't do something. And that's the question that we all have to consider. What can I do? What can I do as an individual? Rick can't knock on any doors at Congress and make them see what I want them to see. I could. It's unlikely they'll respond to me or any one of us individually. But collectively, in groups like this tonight, bigger groups that you heard about that we're all involved in, I'm sure everybody here is involved in a number of groups, can talk about, influence their friends and relatives. These very, very, it seems to me, fundamental ways to make this a more just society.
Rick, I don't want to interrupt because this is a great conversation, but we only have 10 more minutes, just so you know. And
I'm done, other than to say
finish
this.
up, please.
I'm giving an advertisement here. Can I do that?
Oh, good, absolutely.
And the reason I do this, folks, is this is where my ideas came from. Okay, I did not know growing up, having been through school systems in New Jersey, anything about this topic. And after I wrote the book, and as part of that research, I personally decided to get involved in other areas. That doesn't make me anybody different than anybody else. But if you don't know about some of these stories, there's a way to find out. So that's the advertisement.
I just want to say that this is a great book, and it really, like living in Monmouth County, Shrewsbury, Tinton Falls, these are areas where, that are very white areas now, but this was certainly not the case for much of our history. So I really recommend that everybody read this book. We have it at the library also. So
that said, we've got a few minutes left.
We do.
It's wide open to talk about anything. I'm going to
has everybody looked at the chat to see all the different things that have been written in it, or do we need to review that? Anyone?
I've been reading it as we went along and copying the links.
I also wanted to say, I think it was Barbara Withers who had commented about we need to elect more people of color to our government. But I think what Rick said about people, individuals, I think we forget this often. As individuals, we have a lot of power. If we demand that things change, then politicians have to react to this. So, I mean, your voice is really important. Whether you write your local congressperson or, you go to local municipal meetings and try to change your community, your individual voice is the best instrument you have.
Let me jump in. let me jump in and say that, and Rick touched on this, many people who are here are part of other groups or organizations that are doing things. The more you educate yourselves about these topics, the more ideas and avenues for advocacy that you'll have. There are two, and I think it was Judy that mentioned it. New Jersey has a bill that was pending, New Jersey Senate Bill 322, that establishes the New Jersey Reparations Task Force. That's one thing that we can advocate on, and we can push our legislators to create that task force. It's not saying that's going to give reparations to anybody. It's just saying we recognize we need to create a task force to look into some of those questions. On the federal level, HR 40 is the same, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparations Proposals. This piece of legislation has been introduced in every Congress since 1989. And I think it was last year or the year before that it actually finally made some movement. But those are two pieces of legislation that would establish commissions to go into who should get it, how do we do it, what are the ways. I'm a part of the Racial Justice Task Force at Trinity Church in Asbury Park, and they have a reparations task force that I'm a part of. We have different meetings to try to galvanize people, and that's what it's going to take, right? People together calling their representatives and saying, this is something that we want to do. This is something that's important for us, because politicians move based off of public opinion. And that's the way that we should do. Also, I want to mention the program for next month. Is that May the 25th? Is that the right one?
Yeah, let me just check the date.
Yes, May 25th.
May 25th. Gilda Rogers and Rick will probably be a part of it because they're doing a program about the Cedar View Cemetery. Rick, you have any information you want to share about that one?
So if you don't know, the Cedar View Cemetery, right behind St. Leo the Great in Lincroft, is an 1850 Black-owned cemetery that over the years had fallen into neglect. And in the last several years, people before I got involved started to restore it. And we've made great progress. We've got a historian from Rob Chameau, who's done a lot of work on the souls that are interred there. We have the full blessing of the Middletown Township government. In fact, they have just purchased for us and will install it on Memorial Day, a plaque dedicating that cemetery to the folks that put it up there, that I should say initiated the cemetery. And so we're having a Memorial Day ceremony as we did last year. The mayor will be there, and who knows who else. But that's just one community endeavor. The Mingo Jack ceremony on the, by the way, Juneteenth weekend is another. And there's lots of folks doing really great things, including all of you, that is very encouraging. And there are more of us than you might suspect throughout this country, but especially in New Jersey. And I personally believe that New Jersey has a debt that it has to pay. And I love what Let's Talk About Race has done to help that. So thank you.
That's great. Also, I just wanted to say, we had a comment in the chat about making books available to all children and adults. It's really frightening now what's happening with the banned books movement again. I mean, we've always had this sentiment in the country, but it's really escalating. So anything that you can do to read books that people think shouldn't be read, please make sure that you do it, because we don't want to see this escalate anymore. And we certainly at the library believe in having banned books.
So I have a comment. You know, anytime we talk about these issues and, you know, hear more and more stories and statistics, it's easy, certainly for myself and lots of us, to get pretty angry and upset. However, I see our task, and not to say to not be angry or upset, but I see our task really as one of using love and affection and listening and kindness to dissolve the racial resentment that seems to be so toxic for so many people. Like that woman who calls Claire Garland out of the blue is just an example. This can be overcome, but not with more anger, but with love and genuine affection for all people.
I think that's a good note on which to end, Patty.
You're right. I agree with that. And Linda, I remember that you told me that you met up with a person who actually had resentment toward the sign that we actually reflect about this program. You know, I'm responsible for advertising it and all of this. And then I think about what these people what they think when they see it. So, you know, with that note, I just hope for the kindness instead of the hatred.
But you know, I think again, we have to focus on, we have made progress. There are all kinds of conversations going on.
Right.
And there are people that are always going to resist this. But if we use our voice and focus on the positive and push forward to change things, and people have a lot of power, and sometimes we forget that. And it's easy to focus on everything that's so terrible. We can't do that if we're going to move forward. So we thank everybody that comes to this program. You know, we always ask that if you have interest, let us know. You're more than welcome to join the committee that plans this. Get involved in your community. I mean, many of us in Monmouth County live in communities that are not like Red Bank or Neptune or Asbury. It's a lot harder to speak up when you live in a white community, but we need to do that. And I encourage everybody to be a little more verbal than you've been, because change is certainly needed. Thanks so much, Rick. It was a great format tonight. I really
Good
like
program, Rick.
Well, it's all about you. Look,
Thank you, Rick.
Everybody here
Thank
contributed.
you.
It's wonderful. So I
Thank you
enjoyed
so
it.
much.
Thank you very, very much. And we look
Stay
forward
warm,
to
stay warm. It's going to be 28 in the morning.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Good stepping out, Rick.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks
Thanks
to
for all you
of
do.
We'll see
Thanks
you all
very,
again
very
soon, I
much.
hope.
Thanks,
Take
everyone.
care.
Okay.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
And visit the library.